and welcome to tonight's Bible study. Tonight we're starting a new book, the book of Matthew. As mentioned last week in the announcement, we're starting in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 through 5. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother's name was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron. Hezron was the father of Ram. Ram was the father of Abinadab. Abinadab is the father of Nahshon. Nahshon is the father of Salmon. Salmon is the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Solomon, the father of Rehoboam. Rehoboam, the father of Abijah. Abijah, the father of Asa. Asa, the father of Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat, the father of Jehoram. Jehoram was the father of Uzziah. Uzziah, the father of Jotham. Jotham, the father of Ahaz. Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah. Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh. Manasseh, the father of Ammon. Ammon, the father of Josiah. And Josiah, the father of Jehoahaz and his brothers at the time of the exile to Babylon. After the exile to Babylon, Josiah was the father of Shitneel. Shitneel was the father of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was the father of Abiahud. Abiahud the father of Eliakim. Eliakim the father of Azor. Azor the father of Zadok. Zadok the father of Akim. Akim the father of Elihud. Elihud the father of Eleazar. Eleazar the father of Mathan. Mathan the father of Jacob. And Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Thus there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile to Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. What an interesting opening to a gospel, a genealogy of all things. We see this is one of two genealogies that are found in the Bible, in the Gospels. The next one is found in Luke chapter 3, picking up at verse 23. Except in Luke's passage, it starts with Joseph and works its way back. And we see that there's a few little discrepancy with the names if you keep close track of those things. Matthew and Luke does not line up 100%. We're not going to spend a lot of time with that, but what we do see is that 90% of it, 90+% of it does line up. There's one or two names that are different, especially in the latter part in Babylon. For example, we see that Joseph's father was Heli, whereas in this one it says his father was Jacob. So there's a few discrepancy. But Matthew's point in writing this genealogy is to show Jesus is related back through David, David back through Abraham. And that from so when Jesus the Messiah is because his line and lineage is from David. We also see Luke does a little bit different. He shows that his line and lineage go back through David, but he also shows beyond that from Abraham, even before Abraham. He goes back, for example, picking up with Abraham, and it says the sons of Tehran and of Nabor. So it says the son of Isaac was the son of Abraham and such. And then he goes beyond that to Nabor and to Tehran and the Shurug and all the way back to Adam. And Luke makes it that Adam is the son of God. Again, this is showing a genealogy, a line and lineage. why is the genealogy even important, and why is it included in the Bible? As a matter of fact, there's quite often long list of names included in the Bible. People even have the habit, and in some Bibles, in the front, there's usually genealogy that people keep, and they can look up their genealogy, who they're related to. I don't know if you ever received one of those family Bibles that had your name attached to your parents, who was attached to grandparents or great-grandparents. What a treasure to have if you have one of those. Some people don't have that and don't know beyond, maybe grandparents, great-grandparents. But here we see a line and lineage, and Matthew says that there were 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. I don't know if there's exactly 14. Again, that is what Matthew is claiming. We do know that there were 14 generations from David to Babylon, and the reason we know that is if you notice the line and lineage here, that from David to Solomon all the way to Josiah, they were the kings of Judah. They were the kings. And so we saw many names that we were familiar with beside Solomon, Rehoboam, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Uzziah. For example, we know the prophet said in the year that Uzziah died, Isaiah said, I saw the Lord. So we're familiar with some of these names. We also know of Ahaz and Hezekiah, and of course we know of Josiah, for he was the last king along with his brothers. As a matter of fact, what we see that happened is Josiah was one of many kings. As a matter of fact, Babylon came and put up many puppet kings. And so the Bible here says in verse 11, it says, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers, because all his brothers, who just like Solomon had other brothers that we know about, or in the case of Jacob had Judah and his brothers, so there was, all these others. But here we are seeing the line and lineage only of Jesus through Father. I find this interesting in many ways, for the fact that, we see several of these men are brought up over and over again in the Bible, and we have stories about them, especially if you read in Genesis. We know about Abraham, obviously, the patriarch, the founding patriarch, who made the trip to Palestine or to Israel. We now call it Israel, but he was the one that left his home. If you read the story, though, in Genesis, his father, Terah, started that journey but quit halfway, and Abraham is the one that finished it, or Abram, who changed his name to Abraham. And then we know that Abram, who was changed to Abraham, had his son Isaac, and then again we see he had another son, Ishmael. But the line and lineage of Jesus came through Isaac, the child of promise. And then Isaac was the father of Jacob. Little is mentioned here that he had another son, Esau, but we see that again in the Bible. And the whole point that I'm trying to make is that God is making a selection process from Abraham to Isaac, not Ishmael, from Isaac to Jacob, not Esau. And then from Jacob had 12 sons, and it says Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. So it's Judah. And it's very interesting that Judah is the father of Perez and Zehar. And we know that, for example, if you read the story in Genesis chapter 38, that Judah had sons, and his first son married Tamar, and he died. His second son married Tamar, which was a Jewish practice and custom back then in that area, and he died. The third son did not want to marry, but had to marry, and he died. And none of them had a child, and Tamar is mentioned, and I find it very interesting because Tamar's story, and you can read that story in Genesis chapter 38, verse 27, where Tamar pretended to be a prostitute and tricked Judah into having sex with her, and produced twin boys. And when Judah found out that his daughter-in-law was pregnant, he was wanted to have her killed, and then she revealed that he was the father because he was obligated to fulfill that. And so we see a very interesting thing in the line, the lineage of Jesus, the Messiah. Here is a woman who pretended to be a prostitute. And this is not the only person that was quote unquote a prostitute that is in the line and lineage. And I find it very important that we should recognize that God is inclusive even back then, that he include women and he include non-Jews. And we'll see several examples of that, especially through this story. And so verse 3 said, Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. And you can go read that story that I just recited. And it says, Perez was the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram. And it goes on all the way down to Salmon was the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. And I find it very interesting that Nahshon was the father of Shalom, but Shalom's mother was Rahab. Second time a female name is brought up. As a matter of fact, there are 5 females named that we're going to be studying today. The first one was Tamar, who pretended to be a prostitute in order for us to have a child, and through Judah. And now we see Rahab. And we know the story of Rahab because she was, we know the story was when they came out, the Jews were coming back to conquer the promised land. They were coming back from Egypt in the city of Jericho. That Rahab was the prostitute that let down this red thread. She fell in love apparently with Nahshon, sorry, and she was this. Nahshon was one of the spies that went into Jericho, and she was saved, and Nahshon married her and had a son, Salmon, and Salmon was the father of Boaz. And again, we know who Boaz is. So we know who Nahshon is, we know who Boaz is. Again, with the conquering of the land, the story of Jericho, Rahab was spared. And the next one, it says, Boaz was the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. And here we see another woman crops up. So Rahab obviously was not Jewish. She was living in Jericho. So she's not Jewish by birth, etc. But here is a God including in his family tree people that are not pure line or lineage of Jewishness per se. And then Ruth, we know the story of Ruth because there's a book about Ruth. The entire book is how, and many of us are very familiar with it, especially because we use it in marriage vows and such, where Ruth says, where thou goest, I will go, and your God will be my God. Well, Ruth was a Moabite. And here again, Jesus' line and lineage was not pure. David's line and lineage is not pure. And so, Ruth was married, and her husband died, and Boaz, we know the story again with Ruth, married her and had Obed. And Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. And a very interesting thing here we see is these are not necessarily the firstborn child. A lot of people like to make a big deal about the firstborn, but we know David, for example, was not the firstborn. We know Perez and Zerah that Judah, for example, had other sons. Judah himself was not the firstborn. On and on, we see that sometimes second, third, fourth, fifth-born child is the line and lineage that is that Jesus is born from, and that's part of the reason why you see there's a minor discrepancy, especially in the later part. For example, when we go to the kings were descendant, but not necessarily the father of. They just named the one who was the king. So picking up with David, we see David's grandmother was Moabite, Ruth. And his great-grandmother was non-Jewish. She was from Jericho. And going back even further, great, 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 14 generations practically, 12 generations back, Tamar. My point here is God includes everyone and not necessarily just the firstborn. That the line and lineage took a lot of turns. And the Bible include all of it in order for us to get the full impact that God is inclusive. And then we see that David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. And again, we know this story. Bathsheba was taking a bath, and David saw her and sent for her, and then he had her husband Uriah killed and tried to cover it up. And the Bible includes that. Point out, again, Solomon was not the firstborn. As a matter of fact, he was one of way down the line. Just like David was not the firstborn. But Solomon became king, and Solomon was the father of Rehoboam. And Rehoboam was the father of Abinadab. And we know Solomon had many wives, as a matter of fact, and had many kids. But we're just concerned with the one that is in the line and lineage of Jesus. And so that's what we see is happening here. That the Bible does not include everyone, but the ones who are in the line and lineage. And I find it very interesting, starting from David to Jehoiada, that it's mainly the kings. The king passed on to his son, and his son passed on. Pointing again that Jesus is from the line and lineage of David, and the kingship falls to him. And so when Jesus was called, King of the Jews, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the coming son of David, we see that prophecy is also fulfilled. Then obviously they were exiled to Babylon, and then we pick up there from Jehoniah was the father of Sentinel. Sentinel was the father of Zerubbabel, and we don't know if this is the one that brought the people back and was the governor. It could be, but we see a list all the way down to Joseph, and then it says Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And again, we see that Joseph is not actually the father of Jesus. He is the what? Husband. But it said, the Joseph, the husband of Mary. It never says Joseph is the father. And if you read verse 16, it says, and Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. So even though it's going through the line and lineage of Joseph in the book of Matthew, it never says that Joseph is the father. And again, Matthew make this big deal about 14 generations between. Again, we could argue that. But the whole point that Matthew is trying to make is that Jesus is Jewish all the way back through Abraham, the patriarch, that he comes through David, and that he is the Messiah. And so Matthew has a Jewish perspective. He's pointing out that Jesus is Jewish through David. Luke points that out also, but he goes all the way back to Abraham, from not just Abraham, but all the way back to Adam, pointing out that it doesn't matter who you are on this earth. If we go back in time, we're all related to each other, back ultimately to Adam. But that line that Jesus went through Abraham, went through David, to Jesus, and that he's the Messiah. And so I find it interesting, again, these 5 women, Tamar, non-Jewish, pretended to be a prostitute, Rahab, a prostitute, Ruth, a Moabite, Bathsheba, who was, probably, she was married to Uriah the Hittite. We don't know if she's Jewish or not, probably not, who was the mother of Solomon, and Mary. That the women played a part also. And we should not forget that. I know Sunday is Mother's Day, and, we should not forget that women played their part in the line and lineage of Jesus. As a matter of fact, without the women, none of this would happen. Abraham had to have Sarah, and unfortunately they did not mention all the wives or the mother off. They just mentioned the male line. But ultimately, it ends with Mary, and I think that's what one of the difference between the Matthew and the Luke passage is. Luke takes Mary's line and point out her line from Babylon on. We'll pick up there next week. I know it's 20 minutes. We're just going to try something new, something different. So I wanted to do a gospel instead of an epistle. Starting out with this genealogy, something that's not normal, to see that ultimately the point of the gospel is that Jesus is the Messiah. Here's his genealogy, and he's Messiah because he's of the line and lineage of David, the line and lineage of Abraham. Luke points out not only is he the line and lineage of David and of Abraham, but all the way back to Adam. And that Jesus is the Son of God, the Messiah, our Savior. And so we will be looking at this gospel to learn about Jesus. Next week we'll pick up about his birth and all the different things, announcement, and we'll take a few chapters of that. But glad we are starting a different book and to get this perspective. We'll pick up there next week.